you can start recording now. So our theme is detective fiction, and I'll go over some of the key issues of detective fiction so that you can understand what the genre means, how the genre came into being, and what were the philosophical and ideological concerns of the genre. So, point number one is, why did detective fiction rise and what were its predecessors? You see, crime is not particular to any age. Every human society had its share of crime and criminals. Now, therefore, the act of killing, the act of looting, swindling is as old as man himself. Therefore, uh, you see, you can take any number of texts of your classical era as initiators of a detective fiction. The one text that obviously you can think about is Oedipus and the mystery surrounding his birth. Right. So Oedipus could be a model of a first detective text. You can take similarly, for example, My Last Duchess as a detective text, as you sift through the Duke's personality and finally realize that the Duke has killed the Duchess and is going to probably dominate another woman. Now, therefore, detective, but these are not acts of detection as such, because the impulse of detection and the focus of the process of detection is not the theme of the texts. Please remember also that crime becomes a subject of fiction very importantly in the 18th century. And as a result of prose writing, of the rise of prose writings, criminal autobiographies, criminal biographies, newspaper articles, there's a lot of writing about criminals. But this is not detective fiction again, because the criminal here is seen as a protagonist and in some cases, as a hero. For example, let's think about a text like Jonathan Wild or a text like Moll Flanders, where Defoe does talk about the ways in which Moll Flanders is swindling people, pickpocketing them. But the criminal is seen as a hero or a heroine and is seen as a protagonist, right? And whose mechanisms of crime are just ancillary. But the the detection, the process of detection through which this crime is apprehended is not the subject of these fictions. But there's one thing which you need to understand, and that is where I talk about point number 4 that I have projected, is how indeed detective fiction is related with the city. শহরের সঙ্গে এর আত্মিক সম্পর্ক কেন? Because you see, within the village or within a feudal society, crime would largely talk about revenge and petty thievery. Because you see, economic activity in the village was restricted, especially in the feudal hierarchy. So the criminal had very limited opportunities. Crimes were crimes of passion or revenge. But once you have the city and the development of economic activities of a wide range, you have the massive influx of people. You have a kind of people who live upon others as parasites. And therefore, with manifold economic activity, activities like financial swindling increase, activities like rape, for example, would increase, activities against violence against women would increase. And again, because there's so much money floating around, therefore, the question of murder or violence or injury would increase. You see, the city needs its sheriff. And as I pointed out yesterday, with travel across cities and highways, and the rise of highwaymen in general, there is the setting up of pockets of police presence. This is called the Bow Street Runners, and they become the archetype for the later Scotland Yard. Very importantly, please remember that at this point of time, the criminal code is called a bloody code. There are only few punishments, either either hanging or deportation to America, and there is no attempt at reformation of the criminal. Right? This penal code is going to change in 1765, and thereafter jails will be called reformatory. Right? They will be called penitentiaries, so where the criminal can be changed as it were. Now, therefore, I've tried to attempt this question: why did detective fiction rise? What were its predecessors? What were 18th century criminal narratives like? Now, one of the reasons for the rise of detective fiction is, of course, the rise of the philosophy of enlightenment. Remember one thing: what cannot the detective fiction have? This is the first thing that it cannot have is the gods coming down from the heavens and solving the crime. What does the detective depend upon? The detective depends upon empirical evidence. The detective depends upon clues. He rationally analyzes these clues and he comes to a logical conclusion which must satisfy every single precept of that crime. It must explain the crime completely. If there are bloopers, if there is a gap, then the detective fiction is an incomplete fiction, right? And what is the antithesis of the detective story? The antithesis of the detective story is the ghost story. So there cannot be anything supernatural within detective fiction. So you see how very importantly reason, the application of reason and rational explanation is crucial and intrinsic to detective fiction. And therefore, the philosopher I will talk about is Rene Descartes. Now, in another PowerPoint, which I'll send it to you, I have given you the ways in which Descartes says that we must solve a problem. We must come to a rational explanation. He says, first, break up the problem into its different parts. So, does the detective? What is the motive of the crime? How was the crime committed? Who had the opportunity? Right? So, break it up into its constituent problems. One. Two, create solutions which will have no exceptions. So the detective must say, this is how the crime was committed. There can be no other explanation. There can be no other criminal. Right? Three is that there is a process, and that is why Descartes' text in 1670 is called Discourse on Method. You see, the word that Hercule Poirot will be using, and of course the Bomkesh Bokshi stories will also be using, is the method of the detective. You will remember Hercule Poirot talking about the little grey cells and his method. Now, Descartes also talks about this concept of method, the methodology of reasoning from point A to point B to point C. Now, you will have to remember that the detective is the hero of the Enlightenment. Although I might add that there is no detective fiction during the Enlightenment, but the detective is a child and hero of the Enlightenment. He articulates the process through which rationality operates. Now, this is called deductive rationality. Why is this deductive? Because there's already something which has been committed, right? There's already a truth that a murder has been committed and there is a murder. You have to deduce who committed that murder. Therefore, this is a process of deduction. What is the reverse process of rationality? Induction. You start from the basics and then start and build up a kind of a model. But in this case, this is what deductive rationality is all about. There is a time when something has happened. Now let us explain the why and the how of its happening. Right. So my and you can see that the 18th century is also the great age where urbanization starts to happen. Although I would agree with you when you say that in industrialization it increases by leaps and bounds. And it is therefore with enlightenment that the basis of detective fiction is laid. And you also have an elaborate novelistic narrative. Why do I mention the novel? Because the novel talks, the realist novel, as it were, talks about uh, the chronotype, time and place, crucial to the detective fiction. It talks about probability, possibility, very important to the detective fiction. It talks about a teleology and a plot, careful construction of the plot, very important to detective fiction. So all the codes of realistic narrative on which detective fiction will be based are, as it were, being laid during the Enlightenment. This, we can say, is the preparatory time. This is the time when the detective novel is, as it were, dormant, nascent. And then comes industrialization. And with industrialization, the massive influx into society. Now, you see, the point is, society is also extremely wary. Wary Banantalokoroto W-A-R-Y. Why is it wary? Why is it afraid? It is afraid of chaos. So many people packed into uh, slums, seedy places. If they rebel, if they become violent, anarchic, what happens to society? That is a constant fear. And therefore, crime is something that must be carefully calibrated and controlled. And therefore, by this time, we have an elaborate police force. And the police have devised a lot of ways in which crimes can be controlled. This is also the great era of science. And you see how science, forensics, is closely integrated with the detective fiction. Remember the first pioneer of detective fiction, really, Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, Doyle's Holmes is a chemist. He takes opium, if you remember. He has papers on the ashes of different kinds of cigars, the ground, the soil of different parts of London. Therefore, inductive scientific evidence and process becomes very important to detective fiction. Very important also, as you can understand, is the science of human anatomy. The post-mortem report is a very, very crucial aspect of detective fiction. Right? Also, colonialism. You see, of the number of poisons that you have in detective fiction, you have the poisons from exotic places like India and Africa, which become part and parcel of detective fiction. So, forensic sciences, medical sciences, evidence of the fingerprint, for example, all these start to be developed so that detection is no longer just the gray cells, but also backed up by specific scientific experience and knowledge. Right? Therefore, you see, it becomes very important because the police force is now gradually becoming more and more organized. Right? And therefore, I would suggest that the detective has to, and you will see that every single detective works in close association with a police detective. Right? Now, the other question that I had raised earlier is that is there really a detective? Now, this you have to understand that the detective is a fictional creation, the amateur detective, that is. I make this point by referring to writers of detective fiction who have created a kind of a go between between the audience and the police force. So, in order to develop a new hero for rationality, a new Superman had to be created. Somebody who is defined by his mental abilities. Yet, the detective must explain this so easily that we, the reader, must feel that there were the clues and it is so easy to detect. That is why that catchphrase, elementary, my dear Watson. Hercule Poirot, what does he say? Hercule Poirot says, see, Hastings, see. It is the detective's function to make us see clearly. When the detective explains, we must feel that the clues were there. We could have exercised our rationality as well. Therefore, the detective is the new superhero of rationality. But is the detective purely cerebral? There are purely cerebral detectives. For example, in Sherlock Holmes, you have the figure of Mycroft Holmes, who never leaves his club and tries to solve crimes on an easy chair. But what happens is that the fictional detective is created by Doyle in the character of a sleuth, somebody who is physically agile, somebody who goes to the site of the crime, somebody who picks up clues and then explains based on that scientific experience. Hercule Poirot, too, travels to the site of the crime. The site of the crime is a very important site, right? Even though Agatha Christie, in all her detectives, makes, you know, uh, or sort of moves away from the figure of the sleuth. Hercule Poirot is an old man, Papa Poirot, as he's called. Miss Marple is, of course, older. She is, in certain senses, the detective who acts upon pure rationality. Right. Therefore, the detective hero, in my argument, is this new Superman of reason. And he works, and this is very important, is what is the ideology of detective fiction? Now, very importantly, Poirot has something very interesting to say. Murder must never go unpunished. Therefore, why must murder never go unpunished? Crime always pay so that there is social decorum, so that there is social stability. If the rule of the law is violated with impunity, nobody will follow the rule of the law. Therefore, the detective is also in certain cases, the superhero because he's the avenger. He's the avenger for society. You see, there are two crimes in the detective. There are two murders in detective fiction. One that the murderer commits, and the other murder is that society commits by hanging him. The murderer's murderer is evil. Society's murder must be justice. Right? Therefore, it is important to preserve justice. And therefore, detective fiction is an extremely conservative form in many ways. There are, of course, occasionally, moments when the detective takes a call. He says that, there's this clash between justice and morality. So, in certain cases, the murderer is let to go free, right? ব্যোমকেশের কোন একটা গল্পে আছে আমার মনে পড়ছে না যে দাঁড় কাককে মারলে মারা হয় না, right? It is you see that latitude that detective must take, but by and large the detective operates on the principle that by murdering the criminal has violated social norms, and that social norms must be restored and the criminal must be cast out of society. So the detective is at the center of society, preserving justice. The criminal is at the periphery and who must be banished beyond the periphery. Now, there's this question, of course, of biblical revenge, eye for an eye. In many ways, society takes an eye for an eye, it exacts its revenge, right? But then again, there might be cases where a detective might show a bit of mercy. I've talked about the two sets of murders, which you can see here. I have written one set which the criminal operates, and the other set which society operates the to the detective. What is the philosophy of punishment? Now, the question is, detective fiction does not talk about reformation or transformation of the criminal. Very often, you will find that the criminal never changes in detective fiction. For example, Moriarty does not change, right? Moriarty does not change in the Sherlock Holmes stories. তোমাদের মনে আছে কিনা জানি না, যারা ব্যোমকেশ পড়বে, এখানে অনুকূল বাবু যে ডাক্তার, তাকে নিয়ে দুটো গল্প লেখা আছে, right? The first is Sottanneshi, and the other talks about the stealing of the fatal matchstick, দেশলাই কাঠি নিয়ে গল্প। এখানে কিন্তু অনুকূল বাবুর কোনো পরিবর্তন হচ্ছে না, মুখ পুড়ে যাচ্ছে অ্যাসিড পড়ে, but he does not change. So in the detective fiction, you see, the criminal is a category, and that criminal does not change. Therefore, the detective must, at every point of time, apprehend that criminal and put him away behind bars so that he cannot perpetrate this criminality. এই জন্য ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন কিন্তু ক্রিশ্চিয়ান লিটারেচার হতে পারে না, because you see, like Christ, the detective will not want society to extend its other cheek to the criminal. সে কিন্তু বলবে না যে আমার অন্য গালেও থাপ্পড় মারো, because he knows that the criminal will cause great distress to society. Right? And therefore, this notion of disciplining and punishing is an extremely critical aspect of detective fiction. যেখানে পুলিশ পারে না, সেখানে ডিটেকটিভ যায়। The detective is that ultimate agent of punishment. এই কারণেই বলছি, is an extremely important and conservative figure within society. এবার আমাকে একটু দেখতে হবে যে ডিটেকটিভ, when does detective fiction actually come to the forefront? আমি তোমাদের বলেছিলাম 1841 is an approximate date, and you have the murder of the Rue Morgue somewhere later. Dickens is writing Bleak House, Wilkie Collins is writing The Moonstone. এখানে মাথায় রেখো, Wilkie Collins writes about the crime from different perspectives, so she's experimenting with that. Dickens is writing about Inspector Bucket and the finding of the criminal. Then you have Edgar Allan Poe, G.K. Chesterton, and in 1887 comes the defining moment of detective fiction, that is the Sherlock Holmes stories. Right? The point is, why at this point of time? You see, this is the time when I would suggest print. There are numerous magazines which are publishing the detective fictions. একটা খুব important magazine, of course, which is Strand magazine, যেখানে the Sherlock Holmes stories are being published. Print culture has attained almost its fulfillment, and there is this Victorian morality which is operating behind Sherlock Holmes, as also the Victorian waywardness. আরেকটা জিনিস লক্ষ্য করে দেখো কিন্তু, that colonialism also has reached its zenith. So in many ways, the criminals, the people who come back from the Orient, ভারতবর্ষ থেকে কর্নেল মর্গান ফিরে গেছে, they are potential criminals because they have transgressed laws of decorum with impunity. But the golden age of detective fiction is not with Conan. The golden age is the 1930s. এই 1930-এর যুগটাকে বলা হয় the golden age of detective fiction. You remember the novel that you will read is published between 1925 and 1926, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Now, what happens is that these are the interwar period. We have had the spectacular violence of the First World War. You have the fear of the Second World War coming. And therefore, detective fiction emerges with a couple of other things. একটা খুব বিখ্যাত জিনিস তোমাদের বলি, people used to solve crossword puzzles at this point of time. The crossword puzzle becomes extremely important during the 1930s, along with detective fiction. away from the violence of the war একদিকে, and a distraction and a pleasure. Therefore, you have the rise of something which is called the whodunit, which I will come to when I discuss Todorov. Now, this is critically important because detective fiction, while it talks about violence and crime, does not let you into any violent crime being committed while you're reading the story. It is a story about detection. It is a story that no harm happens to the detective as such. So, in a certain way, there is violence which is in the shadows, but you can take the pleasure of reading and sorting out the clues in the present time. And therefore, detective fiction acts as a kind of, I would say, during this period, as a kind of an anesthetic to the trauma that war has already caused. And therefore, it is this 1920s that you have, and the 30s that you have, the detection club, to which once again I will refer in another lecture, which is founded by uh, a lot of these detective fiction writers who would assemble in the evening, talk about their fictions, exchange ideas, and put them into practice in their fictions. Right? So, তোমাদের এটা বুঝতে হবে কিন্তু rise of the city is integral to the rise of detective fiction. The Enlightenment is integral to the rise of detective fiction. There are forces like colonialism which go into the making of detective fiction. Right? And there is this fascination with crime, procedure, police, etc., that is associated with detective fiction. আরেকটা জিনিস তোমাদের কাছে পরিষ্কার করে নেওয়া দরকার, this figure of the amateur detective is a literary figure, right? There is nothing called the amateur detective in real life. আমি তোমাদের কালকে বলেছি যে তোমরা ফোন ঘুরিয়ে কোনো ফেলুদাকে পাবে না, তোমরা ফোন ঘুরিয়ে কোনো ব্যোমকেশ বক্সীকে ট্রেস করতে পারবে না। ফোন ঘুরিয়ে যাদের ট্রেস করতে পারবে, they are people who undergo painstaking following করে ওই যেটা তোমরা কালকে বলেছো, কার বিয়ের আগে কটা অ্যাফেয়ার ছিল, কে কোথায় যাচ্ছে, কোনো কর্পোরেট ইয়ে হচ্ছে কিনা, all these are becoming parts and parcels of detection. So there are professional detectives, no doubt, but they don't uncover any truth. They, in fact, cannot solve any crime as such. They can uncover truth. That's a different issue altogether. The only possible detective that happens is the police detective. And that is why it is very important to understand that there are specialized police branches where very bright policemen are put into this process of detection. Somebody mentioned the CID. We could talk about the CBI, right? And once again, more and more, you see, modern detective fictions are becoming dependent on technology rather than any other force in that sense of the term. Now, what are the different kinds of detective fiction which you have read? I will not talk about Todorov today because Todorov demands a separate class. But what are the different kinds of detective fiction? This I will briefly talk about. The first is the cozy mystery or the classical whodunit. What is the form? The form is like this, that certain people assemble in a certain location. Right? It might be a country house, it might be a club, it might be a city, and a crime is committed. There are a finite number of suspects. তুমি জানো 10টা লোক আছে, 10টা লোকের মধ্যে একজন খুন করেছে অথবা একজন চুরি করেছে। The detective comes in, brings them together, and solves the crime based on clues. Right? এটাকে বলা হয় cozy mystery বা classical whodunit. কে করেছে? Right? There might be something called the locked room mystery, অর্থাৎ একটা বন্ধ ঘরের মধ্যে থেকে একটা জিনিস হারিয়ে গেছে অথবা একটা খুন হয়েছে। Apparently there is no solution to the crime and the detective comes in and provides an ingenious solution. এটা এক ধরনের detective fiction. There's something called a hard boiled detective. এটা 1940s এর পর থেকে লেখা শুরু হয়ে যায়, and you have figures like Raymond Chandler, etc., who are writing these detective fictions. These are stories of chase, these are stories where the detective travels, follows. মানে এখানে কিন্তু there's no cerebral uh, effect. There is more of chasing, there's more of hard evidence gathering. So the detective is more like the policeman. Only he is beyond the legal apparatus. And then, of course, you have something which is called the police procedural, where you actually see the policeman as detective. যারা ব্যোমকেশ পড়ছো আমার সাথে তারা মাথায় রেখো যে প্রথম বাংলা ডিটেকটিভ রচনা লেখেন প্রিয়নাথ মুখোপাধ্যায় বলে এক ভদ্র। তিনি কলকাতা পুলিশের ডিটেকটিভ শাখার একজন মেম্বার ছিলেন, কলকাতা পুলিশেরই লোক ছিলেন, যে কারণে তার লেখার টাইটেলটাই ছিল দারোগার দপ্তর। এবং তিনি এই দারোগার দপ্তরটা তোমরা কিনে পড়তে পারো, ভালো লাগবে। হোয়াট হ্যাপেন্স ইজ, যেই মোমেন্টে কলোনিয়ালিজম হলো সেই মোমেন্টে কলকাতা শহরে নানান ধরনের অদ্ভুত অদ্ভুত ক্রাইম শুরু হলো। যেমন ধরো একটা গল্পে রয়েছে যে হাউ দ্য প্রস্টিটিউট উড রব পিপল অ্যান্ড কিল দেম, রাইট? এটা কিন্তু দেখো ওই মল ফ্যান্ডাসের গল্পটার মতোই, কিন্তু ইট ইজ সিচুয়েটেড ইন কলকাতা অ্যান্ড দি এসেন্স ইজ অন অ্যাপ্রিহেন্ডিং দ্য ক্রাইম। সুতরাং শহরের সঙ্গে, দারোগার সঙ্গে, পুলিশের সঙ্গে একটা ইন্টিগ্রাল রিলেশনশিপ যেন রয়েছে। You see, in the Agatha Christie stories, you have Inspector Jack. In Sherlock Holmes, you have Inspector Lestrade. So, the very important part of this subgenre of this detective fiction is the story which is called the police procedural. এই পুলিশ প্রসিডিউরালের সব থেকে বিখ্যাত এখনকার প্র্যাকটিস, দিস ইজ বিং রিটেন রাইট নাও বাই আ পারসন কল্ড মাইকেল কনেলি, যার ইন্সপেক্টরের নাম হচ্ছে ইন্সপেক্টর বশ স্টোরিজ। ইফ ইউ ওয়ান্ট ইউ ক্যান ওয়াচ, দের ইজ আ সিরিজ অন অ্যামাজন উইচ ইউ ক্যান ওয়াচ, অ্যান্ড ইনফ্যাক্ট তোমরা হয়তো লক্ষ্য করেছো ভেরি পপুলার টিভি সিরিজ ইজ কল্ড সিআইডি। আচ্ছা, আবার দের ইজ another of uh, another kind of police fiction which is called detective fiction, which is called the anatomy or the post-mortem detective fiction. সেখানে কি হচ্ছে যে সেখানে people who are actually performing the autopsy they are uncovering the truth, অর্থাৎ মেডিকেল এভিডেন্সের ভিত্তিতে the element of the crime is being disclosed. এটা is a very famous, there's a very famous woman writer called Tess Gerritsen who's writing this. যার there's a duo who functions. একজন হচ্ছে the inspector and the other is the postmortem, the lady who does, the doctor who does the postmortem. So it's a duo who happens. Achha, there's a third there's another characteristic of detective fiction, another subgenre, is the legal thriller or the legal detective. যার বিখ্যাত এক্সাম্পল হচ্ছে পেরি মেসন। তোমরা যদি কেউ কাঁটায় কাঁটায় বলে একটা সিরিজ আছে, আমার ধারণা ওটা বোধহয় লিখেছেন নারায়ণ সান্যালী, বোধহয় লিখেছেন। হ্যাঁ, এই কাঁটায় কাঁটায় সিরিজ is the exact copy of the detective fiction where the lawyer with the private detective acts as an agent of truth. অর্থাৎ আমার পয়েন্টটা হচ্ছে, once the classical whodunit establishes itself, there are multiple ways in which detective fiction proliferates. একের পর এক নতুন ফর্মে ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন আমাদের কাছে আসছে। And you see, gradually it becomes more and more complicated. For example, দেখবে in the more modern detective stories, postmodern detective stories, it is no longer just the story of detection of the crime, but also the personal trauma, angst, crisis of the detective. এটা লক্ষ্য রেখো that most detective fictions are very gendered. The detective is male, right? As the detective story progresses, you have female writers experimenting with it. There are female, detectives who are coming into the forefront. আবার there is young adult detective. তোমরা হয়তো দেখেছো পাণ্ডব গোয়েন্দাকে নিয়ে কিরকম প্রবলেম হচ্ছে। ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনের সঙ্গে কি প্রেমের গল্পকে জোড়া যায়? জুড়ে দিলেই ভীষণ hue and cry হচ্ছে, right? So the detective fiction, my point is, starting as a genre which is very structurally determined, detective fiction gradually branches out into very many potential forms. And this is the magic of detective fiction, that it provides pleasure as well as, talking about a lot of ideologies, concerns of society. এর পরের ক্লাসে আমরা দেখব যে what are the theories of detective fiction and what is the pleasure of detective fiction. ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন পড়ার আনন্দটা কোথায়, এবং ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন লেখার কায়দাগুলো কি, নিয়ম কানুনগুলো কি। and that is where I will start off with Stefan Todorov. তদরবের এসেটা আমি তোমাদের পাঠিয়ে দিয়েছি। তার সাথে আমি তোমাদের আমার আজকের যে রিসোর্সটুকু রয়েছে 4 পাতার একটা কোয়েশ্চেনের, এই ধরনের জিনিসটাও আমি তোমাদের পাঠিয়ে দিচ্ছি। নাও ইউ গো থ্রু দিস। একটা জিনিস তোমাদের রিকোয়েস্ট করা, যে যেহেতু আমরা অনলাইনে চলে গেছি, আমি যেগুলো পাঠাচ্ছি সেগুলো যদি তোমরা একটু পড়ে আসো বা একবার চোখ বুলিয়ে আসো, 5 মিনিট সময় লাগবে, আমি খুব বেশি কিছু দেবো, তাহলে কিন্তু তোমাদের অনেক রাইট। ইট ইজ উইথ দ্যাট that I think I have kept my time. শরদিন্দু এক্ষুনি আমাকে বলবে যে লেকচারটা শেষ হতে চলেছে। So it is with that that I will close this particular lecture. যতটুকু সময় বাকি রয়েছে, if there is any question that you want to ask, ততটুকু সময়ের মধ্যে I would be glad to answer your questions. I will stop the screen sharing at this point of time, and you can put your questions. Thank you. Right. Would anybody like to unmute and ask anything? See, অনলাইন টিচিং এর এটাই হচ্ছে প্রবলেম, জানো তো। আমি তোমাদের দেখতে পাচ্ছি না, তোমরা বুঝতে পারলে কিনা আমি বুঝতে পারছি না।
Hello.
হ্যাঁ, বলো।
Dada, it's Devarpita from third sem.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
দেবার্পিতা, তুমি প্রশ্নটা করছো? ওকে, এনিবডি এলস? দেবার্পিতার বোধহয় কানেক্টিভিটিটা নষ্ট হয়ে গেছে। দেবার্পিতা হয়তো লিখতে পারো। If there is any question you would want to write also, I'm free, I'm fine with that. Right, I'm looking at the chat box.
বলছি।
হ্যাঁ, বলো বলো।
হ্যাঁ, মানে একটা জায়গায় যে গ্যাদারিংটা হচ্ছে এবং তার মধ্যে থেকেই যে মানে মার্ডারটা করেছে, এইটাকে কি মানে সেই মানে সেই বলে না ক্লাসিক্যাল, কি ওইটা বুঝতে পারলাম না, মানে ওই ক্লাসিক্যাল
হ্যাঁ, হু ডান ইট, এটাকে বানানটা হচ্ছে WHODUNNIT, হু ডান ইট।
আচ্ছা,
বেসিক্যালি ইজ আ, মানে এটাকে পরবর্তীকালে কোজি মিস্ট্রি বলা হচ্ছে এই কারণে যে এই জনরাটার ওয়ান অফ দ্য মেজর আসপেক্ট হচ্ছে প্রবলেম সলভিং, এক্সারসাইজ ইওর র্যাশনালিটি। এবার যদি দেখা যায় যে খুনটা বাইরে থেকে একজন কেউ করে গেছে, তাহলে তো র্যাশনালিটির জায়গা নেই, সেটা তো র্যান্ডম মার্ডার হয়ে গেল, তাই না? বুঝতে পেরেছো? সুতরাং সবাইকে এক জায়গায় করা এবং খুঁজে বের করা ফ্রম দ্য ক্লুজ, মানে ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনটা, এটা আমি পরের দিন তোমাদের বলবো। ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন ইজ লাইক আ গেম, বুঝতে পেরেছো? হ্যাঁ, তো এই গেমের রুলসটাই হচ্ছে দ্যাট সার্টেন পিপল হ্যাভ অ্যাসেম্বলড, and once certain people have assembled, there are a finite number of suspects. A finite number of suspects এর মধ্যে apparently there will be red herrings. Red herrings মানে কি? তোমার মনে হবে যে এই লোকটাই মার্ডার করেছে, কিন্তু সেই লোকটাই যদি মার্ডার করে তাহলে তো তোমার আর ডিটেকটিভের মধ্যে কোনো ডিফারেন্স নেই, তাই না? এবং ডিটেকটিভকে খুঁজে বের করতে হবে যে এই রেড হেরিং সত্ত্বেও হু ইজ দি অ্যাকচুয়াল মার্ডারার। তোমরা যারা সবাই পড়ো তারা জানবে যে যাকে তুমি মার্ডারার ভাবছো সে কিন্তু আদতে মার্ডারার অনেক সময় হয় না, হয় অন্য কেউ। এই যে গ্যাদার করে ডিটেকটিভকে আইডেন্টিফাই করতে হবে দ্য মার্ডার, এবং দ্য মার্ডারার মাস্ট নট অনলি বি আইডেন্টিফাইড, হি মাস্ট কনফেস অ্যান্ড হি মাস্ট বি অ্যাপ্রিহেন্ডেড। বুঝতে পেরেছো? এটা হচ্ছে একটা বৃত্ত, একটা বলয়, একটা সার্কেল। কমিটিং অফ দ্য মার্ডার, violation of the social code, identification of the murder, and finally apprehending the murder by justice. তোমাদের এখানে মাথায় রাখতে হবে যে র্যান্ডম ক্রাইম যেগুলো বাইরে থেকে এসে কেউ করে দিয়ে চলে গেল, সেই মার্ডারের থেকে কিন্তু ক্লাসিক্যাল হু ডান ইট করা যাবে না, বুঝতে পেরেছো? তাহলে সেটা অন্যরকম, সেটা একটা থ্রিলারের স্টোরি হয়ে যাবে, যে বাইরে থেকে একজন মার্ডার করে গাড়িতে চেপে পালাচ্ছে, তখন ডিটেকটিভ তাকে তাড়া করেছে, আলটিমেটলি তাকে ধরলো, ধরে তাকে যা কলার চেপে যাচ্ছে সে কাছে নিয়ে চলে। দ্যাট ইজ এ ডিফারেন্ট জনর। আমার বক্তব্যটা কি, ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনের মধ্যেও অনেক রকম চেঞ্জেস আছে, রাইট? আচ্ছা, এবার পিতা একটা প্রশ্ন করছে, Dada, as you said about Daroga Dattu, the prostitute who used to rob her customers, that is Toilokkotari, that case somehow the author is sympathizing with her. The social conditions obliged her to make the crimes. The detective might be sympathetic. আমি তো বললাম, in certain cases the detective might be so sympathetic and understanding that he might even let her go. But this is it's a very rare exception. Right. Now, একটা জিনিস মাথায় রেখো, সেটা হচ্ছে there are only very few detective fictions where the detective talks about social circumstances as leading to the crime. এটা নর্মালি কিন্তু হয় না। মানে অধিকাংশ ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন the criminal either acts on the spur of the moment, right, is threatened because তার প্রপার্টি চলে যাচ্ছে, অথবা তাকে এক্সপোজ করে দেওয়া হচ্ছে, রাইট? আর তা না হলে the criminal is a psychopath, যে রেকারেন্টলি ক্রিমিনাল একটা করবে। ইনফ্যাক্ট আগাথা ক্রিস্টিতে দেখবে there are multiple murders। তোমাদের মনে আছে ওই গল্পটা যেটাতে ওই কি গোলাপ কলোনি বলে চিড়িয়াখানা, যে ব্যোমকেশের গল্পটা তোমরা সিনেমায় দেখেছো, রাইট? সেখানে দেখবে যে বনবিহারী না কি ওর নামটা আমি খেয়াল করছি না, হি ইজ এ কম্পালসিভ ক্রিমিনাল, যে পরপর করছে। সুতরাং এই যে গল্পটার কথা তুমি বলছো, দ্যাট ইজ অ্যান এক্সেপশন রাদার দ্যান দ্য রুল। আমি তোমাদের দুটো ছোট সিনেমা দেখতে অনুরোধ করবো। একটা হচ্ছে চিড়িয়াখানা, ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট, মানে যেহেতু তোমরা ব্যোমকেশটা পড়ছো। আর 2 নম্বর, একটা টরেন্টে ইত্যাদিতে পাওয়া যায়, দেখবে একটা সিনেমা আছে, ইউটিউবে আজ থাকলে দেখে নিও, খামোশ বলে। দিস ইজ ওয়ান অফ দ্য ফার্স্ট ফিল্মস which was directed by বিধু বিনোদ চোপড়া, মানে যে ফরিন্দা যিনি তৈরি করেছেন, ফরিন্দা, রাইট? এই খামোশে নাসিরুদ্দিন শাহ আছে, শাবানা আজমি আছে। ইটস আ ওয়ান্ডারফুল way of getting acclimatized or familiarized with the way that the detective fiction operates. এটা একটু করে তোমরা দেখতে পারো, পড়ে দেখতে পারো, রাইট? এইভাবে যদি দেখি, তাহলে এই ত্রৈলোক্যতারিণীর গল্পটা এবং the way in which she is seen as a victim of circumstances is one of the exceptions of detective fiction. It's not the rule. তবে আবার আমি বলছি, the detective has that moral latitude to consider whether খুব খারাপ একটা লোককে যে মার্ডার করছে, যেমন ধরো মানে কেউ হয়তো একজন ব্ল্যাকমেলারের কাছ থেকে চুরি করছে বা মার্ডার করেছে, তখন ডিটেকটিভ তাকে ছেড়ে দিল। কিন্তু নর্মালি কিন্তু দেখবে ডিটেকটিভ উইল ব্রিং দ্য ক্রিমিনাল টু বুক। তা না হলে মানে ওই যে গ্রে এরিয়া, যে আমি ছেড়ে দেবো কি দেবো না, মার্ডারকে জাস্টিফাই করবো কি করবো না, রাইট? সেটা নিতে গেলে ইউ ওপেন আপ আ ক্যান অফ ওয়ার্মস। যে কারণে দেখবে মার্ডার মোস্ট ফাউল, এই কথাটা ব্যবহার করা হয় অধিকাংশ ক্ষেত্রে। এবং তোমরা এটা বারবারই লক্ষ্য করবে যে the act of murder is very often at the center of detective fiction. Why? Because murder is the most heinous of crimes. You are taking